for the end of the week and you are spending your afternoon, when I'm sure that energy levels are not at the absolute highest, to spend some time thinking about science. There is nobody, genuinely nobody in the world I would rather talk about primary science to than Kirsty Simkin, our author of How to Lead It Primary Science. My colleague for years. We first met when we were teaching together almost a decade ago now, and Kirsty's still at that school, Reach Academy Feltham, and now leads across both of the schools in the trust and the wonderful Feltham in southwest London. And I just cannot tell you how much I've learned from Kirsty over the years about primary science, teaching it, leading it, making it exciting for children, getting to awe and wonder, but also technical knowledge. And so I'm delighted to share her with you for the next 40 minutes or so, because she has pulled all of that wisdom, all of that experience, all of that passion into this fantastic book, How to Lead It Primary Science, which we hope is a gift to the profession for new science leaders, but also those who have been doing the job for a couple of years and maybe want to sense check their kind of approach. And so we're going to get into that. Kirsty, how has your Thursday been going so far? How's your half term been going so far?
Oh, thank you. That was a really lovely introduction. Thursday's been good. I was saying I've taught year one this morning and you have reception this afternoon. So full of lots of, well, I was going to say lots of energy. That's not true. Teaching year one and reception in the same day doesn't fill me with loads of energy, but it has put a big smile on my face because I absolutely love spending time with the younger year groups. I always leave with a big smile on my face because they're just so full of joy. We did den building was the main kind of period of excitement in our last reception bit of the afternoon. And I had maybe more fun than the children.
I absolutely love it. And that, I suppose, is also just a wonderful feature of the book, is that you are still, there's no time for kind of overly idealistic or overly theoretical kind of abstraction with this stuff, because you're living and breathing this life in school, day in, day out. And so before we get into our first proper question, I haven't actually asked you this, but do you think how did that I guess change the way you approached the book, perhaps, the sort of having all of your degree is in science, and all of that technical knowledge, but also the very kind of getting home after teaching all day and sitting down to write it? How did that perhaps change the way that you approached writing the book?
Well, I'd say I did most of the writing in the summer holiday, less in the evenings. I'm not a high energy person in the evening after a work day, but I really enjoyed writing in the summer holidays. For me, it feels like having a science degree in my school. I was like, I have to do this. Like, I have to lead this subject. Like, I actually have this knowledge in my brain, and I actually love this subject. And I think primary teachers are absolutely amazing because we are expected to be experts in all of the subjects we teach, which is just not really possible. And so that's kind of what I've always enjoyed most about being a science lead, is being like, oh no, I know about this. Science is my thing. Like, let me do the planning. Let me like kind of make this easier for everybody. And if someone could help me out with music, please, that would be great.
That's the trade. The science.
That's the trade. Music is my, it used to be PE, but I have got better at teaching PE and I find it less scary now. But I am still a little bit scared when I have to teach music because I am really ungifted.
Just working all the harder for it. And I suppose that science is I sometimes think of it as like the forgotten core subject, in that it is, alongside reading, writing and maths, it is a designated core subject, but it isn't always treated that way in primary. But like potentially because, as you say, folks maybe don't feel as confident with it. There's maybe less support available than reading, writing and maths. Of course, the statutory test has gone from Key Stage 2, which I'm sure had an impact as well. But I think it just, for me, it underlined how important it is to get really good development and guidance and support for leaders of science in primary school. So delighted that you've written this book. We're going to go into our first question. folks will be able to see from this chapter list that anything that you might be interested in, anything that might be on your action plan or your key priorities or objectives for the year, there's a chapter on it. Kirsty takes you right back to sort of thinking about what it really means to lead science and why it's so important, to engaging with research evidence with specific examples of research from science. And you can see the rest of the chapters there, from disciplinary literacy and writing like a scientist, right back to kind of designing a curriculum from scratch. But I'd like to go into my favorite section from the book, and we spoke about this when you were writing it, because it was one of those. It felt to me like one of those like threshold concept things of like, once I read this, I just don't think I'll ever look at science in the same way. It was just it was so transformational for me. And it was this idea around Harlan's big ideas in science. So first of all, could you tell us what are Harlan's big ideas in science? And then you actually adapt them within the chapter, and sort of match them. You break them down a little bit, match them to the national curriculum. So could you talk a little bit about why you felt that they needed a bit of adaptation, and how you went about sort of arriving at your big ideas and smaller ideas in science?
Yeah, of course. So Harlan is the lead scientist on this paper. Essentially, Harlan's big ideas was like 10, 11, I've forgotten the exact number, of like scientists and professionals in science got into a room and sat down together, and over a series of conferences decided what would be their like defining chunks of core knowledge that all people, but all scientists need to know. Like, what are the really powerful ideas? And they came up with this list of Harlan's big ideas. And I think for people writing curriculum, or people who are really interested in curriculum, which I am quite nerdy about writing science curriculum, these are kind of like quite fundamental, because all good curriculums start with exactly that, with, okay, well, what are the most important chunks of knowledge in this subject that we need to teach? These are them, okay? And then the next step is, right, okay, how do we break that down? And Harlan's big ideas, some of them are, yeah.
I've got it to give people a flavour of this. So organisms are organised on a cellular basis.
Yeah, would be one, exactly.
Objects can affect other objects at a distance.
Yeah.
So these are examples of like how big these ideas are, right?
Yeah, exactly. So like objects affecting each other on the like at distance. So yeah, they're really big. They're things that you have to understand in order to understand how the world works. But they're also big in that they're like, I liken them in the book to like the keystone of an arch. So if the big idea is like the top keystone, then they're supported by all these smaller ideas, where if you understand all those small little steps, then that's what brings you to that understanding of that big keystone idea. And so for us as science teachers, we need to be thinking about like, which of those small steps are we teaching? And for us as kind of subject leaders or curriculum designers, then we need to think about like that whole sequence of the small step to the big step. And there's a book by Jasper Green, which is called Powerful Knowledge in Science and How to Teach It. I think it's really good, but it takes Harlan's big ideas and it thinks about how you teach them in a secondary school. And so I basically wanted to kind of do that, but for primary school, and that hasn't happened before. Nobody has taken those and made them primary level. And Jon read some of them. Like, some of them are not, organisms are organized at cellular level. Okay, well, I'm not going to be teaching my reception children about cells, and I'm not saying by any means that we teach those really big, tricky concepts way earlier than we need to, but all of those big ideas start with really small steps that we can start to teach from really young. So for example, if we think about evolution, classic, very important bit of science knowledge that we would like everybody to be able to understand, we can start teaching about evolution in nursery and reception, because at nursery and reception we start teaching about the diversity of life, and they start learning about, how many different types of plants and bugs and mini beasts, etc., that there are. And that is a really important step to eventually understanding evolution. You need to understand that organisms on life are all different before you can start to think about, okay, but how did those differences come about? So yeah, I mean, I could talk about this for a really long time, Jon, and I know you could too, because you also love getting really nerdy about knowledge and curriculum. But this was my favorite chapter to write.
Because it felt like it would be so helpful for a science lead, because your job is not just to think, okay, I'm teaching evolution in year 6, I need to teach evolution in year 6 really, really well, and I'm going to, think of some activities I can get to the children to do. Like it's a way of kind of framing children's journey through science through all of the year groups, and it's a way of kind of organizing that subject in a way that doesn't feel, you managed to contain it within a table that kind of fits across 2 pages in your book, so it feels manageable as a kind of organizing framework, and yet specific enough that actually different teachers can find it useful.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to create a framework that someone could just pick up and use, that who doesn't want to spend hours diving into science curriculum research on the internet and thinking about different ways of organizing knowledge. It's like, here you go, like, I've done it for you. Here are all the references. Here are all the big, it's not just me. It's just me reframing those ideas. And hopefully for other science leads, they'll be able to just like pick up that list and run with it and show really clear progression and really clear curriculum thinking to anyone who wants to ask them about their subject.
Thanks, Kirsty. So let's move on to this next sort of section that I wanted to talk about, because you've got a case study in here, and it's my chance to confront you, because I'm quite worried that this case study is anonymized but based on you visiting one of my lessons in the past, and it made me wince, because it's this difficult thing of what happens, really difficult. I'm glad that you kind of grasped the nettle on this in the book, of what do you do as a science lead, or any middle leader, but a science lead. You go into a classroom and you hear a teacher say something wrong. And the example that you give here is that fossils are bones. So as a science lead, you go into a classroom and you see the teacher telling the kids that fossils are bones, and it was embarrassingly late that I realized that fossils weren't actually bones, because they do look like bones.
They do. That's why it's a common misconception.
And when you look at like fossils in a museum, they definitely look like bones, the way that they put them together in a skeleton. But I'm really glad that you included, and these case studies are throughout the book to kind of make it very concrete and real, and I'm sure that lots of science leaders will feel some solidarity with sort of seeing, oh yeah, this reminds me of something that happened last week or last month. But this, I suppose, this is relatively awkward and difficult to address as a science lead, right? Because it feels a bit judgmental and to say to somebody. So how would you how would you do you suggest in the book sort of thinking about misconceptions in science, particularly with teachers and kids?
I think, like, first of all, just being really, really upfront, like, we all hold misconceptions about science, like whether you've done a science degree or not. And like, I also have embarrassing misconceptions that I held through to adulthood, having done a science degree. For example, I did think, and until really recently, that deoxygenated blood was actually blue.
I know a nurse that thinks this. So
like, they just exist. They're really prevalent. So like, I think just being a bit honest about the fact that like it like, you don't need to be embarrassed about it. We all have these misconceptions that we have. And so then being like, right, well, if we have these misconceptions, of course our children are going to have misconceptions and preconceptions. And so like, the way that we tackle it is, first of all, like, as science teachers, we do need to be really clear on what all those common misconceptions are. And luckily, there are lots of people who've done lots of work to make really helpful lists for us. So for example, the IOP, the Institute of Physics, has like loads of pages on like common misconceptions for each topic, and then ideas of how to like explain the correct conception. And Plan Science also as well has really clear like curriculum breakdown for every unit, and they always include in their unit plans like possible misconceptions. So that's like naming it, like we all have them. Like, it is important that we're aware of them before a lesson. These are the places you can go and find them. Have fun with it. Like, oh, I didn't. Good. I'm glad we've figured out now that deoxygenated blood isn't blue. Brilliant. Thank you. And then like, how then do we diagnose those in our pupils? So like using diagnostic questions to find out if they do or don't have different misconceptions. And then the next step is obviously how we address any misconceptions. And that is actually the hardest part, because when you have a misconception about something, it's really hard to change like a person's mind, that you have to prove it to them, which luckily is what we're quite good at doing in science, is we do like to set up experiments and prove. But, you know, if you think about that, if you ask that classic question where you're like, oh, if I drop a ton of feathers and a ton of bricks, like which will fall to the ground first? And like, it just feels like common sense. But when you actually like show children videos of it happening, you know, add and explain about air resistance, X, Y, Z, like then you start to change those misconceptions. But yeah, I think that's how. So be honest about the fact that we all have them. Find out what the common misconceptions are for that subject. And if you also have experienced science teachers, you know, in your school, then going to them are good, because they'll know like, oh yeah, normally when I teach this topic, children find this bit really hard, or they often think this. Then it's about diagnostic questions, finding out what your children do or don't believe. And then it's the fun / hard part of like disproving their original conceptions and showing them and teaching them the real science.
Yeah, you're right that you really do that experience like within the school, because the more you teach something, you do like with evolution, for example. I kids would commonly, one that I picked up is they would think that the animals are like choosing to change, that they're kind of like making a decision to adapt to their environment. So we say, oh, birds adapted to their environment, like it was or this butterfly adapted to its environment, like it sort of woke up on a Tuesday and decided, oh, I'm grey and this makes me stick out, so I better turn brown, and sort of like and so that in their head it almost feels like, oh, we chose to change in this way. And I suppose other teachers would have lots of other examples as well of, oh, if you're teaching that, then the kids were definitely going to think this thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Super. Let's move on to our next chapter, and you end very helpfully. You end every chapter with an example PD session, which again is going to be really helpful for science leads, because part of their job is going to be leading PD sessions, and so they have a dozen of them in this book ready to go. So that's probably a year's worth of PD sessions ready to go there. And this particular one, you focused on what I know is top of lots of leaders' priority list at the moment, which is vocabulary, teaching vocabulary, thinking about subject-specific vocabulary. And in this session, you sort of talk a little bit about how we can support teachers to do this in science, to develop vocabulary in science. So could you just talk us through why you would structure a PD session in this way as a science lead, and why that kind of structure and approach is likely to be effective in changing teachers' kind of practice and getting to the impact in the classroom with kids' outcomes and vocabulary?
Yeah, definitely. So with all of the CPD sessions, or the PD sessions, professional development sessions, I have thought carefully about using the Education Endowment Fund like recommended things that make a personal development session really good. I'm also really lucky that I have had really good experience of great professional development in the school that I have trained and taught and all those kind of things in. And I think like elements that are really important are always starting with like the why, or the research, or the like hook of why this is important. So that would definitely be the case in this session on vocabulary. I think like talking about the word gap between kind of more affluent versus less affluent pupils is really important. And then I always normally start with an exercise where I like put a piece of scientific text on the board, and we like basically black out all the tier 3 words, all of the like more complicated science vocabulary, because I'm assuming children don't know those because I haven't taught them to them. And then we block out some of the harder tier 2 words, and then we try and like understand the text, and it's basically impossible. And I think again that links to the why of like, okay, but why is it so important that we're teaching this vocabulary explicitly? Oh, because it's actually impossible to understand scientific text unless you do. And vocabulary is important.
Sorry, yeah. Could you just talk us through? I'm sure that people are well versed in this, but could you just talk us through tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 words? Of course.
So tier 1 words are just words that are used really commonly in everyday language that we would assume that children kind of pick up just by speaking the English language. They don't need to be explicitly taught. Things like dog, cat, behind. Then tier 2 words are words that we wouldn't expect children to just pick up the meaning of necessarily. So they do need to be explicitly taught. And they are words that are used across the curriculum. So for example, like the word summarise would be a tier 2 word, because you would need that across multiple disciplines. But a child needs to know what that means. And often tier 2 vocabulary can actually be holding back people's understanding. And then you have tier 3, which is really subject specific. And in science, we have loads of tier 3 vocabulary. Like we're asking children to learn and understand lots of tricky words: photosynthesize, reproduction, thermometer, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is really important for us to be aware of as teachers and as subject leaders, because pupils' understanding of that vocabulary is going to be fundamental to them understanding the topic, understanding the questions that you're asking, doing well on assessments, etc. So that's the different layers of vocabulary.
It's really helpful, because I guess you think because they just pick up some language that they'll just sort of pick up the technical language as well,
Yeah.
just sort of by osmosis. No pun intended.
Yeah. And with science, like we do, like all subjects have tier 3 vocabulary, but if you were to like put a piece of text down for a child that you're using in a science lesson, there's going to be like a much higher level of tier 3 vocabulary than in, for example, a history source. Doesn't mean that there isn't any tier 3 in history, that absolutely is, but like the level of it in science is really high. And so it's really important. But that's important for 2 reasons. One, because our children aren't going to understand it unless we explicitly teach them. But also it means we have to really think about like cognitive load and what we're explicitly teaching, because you also can't teach 50 words in one lesson and expect children to understand and know the definition of all of those. And so actually, like what I will often do in PD sessions with teachers is like get them to, first of all, I do the task where I'm like getting them to see how many words really children would struggle to understand in a text, so they understand how important it is. Then I get them to have a go at identifying themselves, so checking that teachers actually can pull out what is tier 2 and what is tier 3 vocabulary. And then I spend some time looking at how, if I was planning that lesson or planning to teach that input or that piece of text, like what words would I explicitly teach and spend loads of time making sure the children absolutely know? What would I ignore? So I would assume the children already know that from prior knowledge, or it's just not important, or it's tier 1. Or what do I know that they need to understand the text, but I don't have time to explicitly teach, or it's just not as important. So for example, I don't know, if it was a text about temperature and changing seasons in Key Stage 1, then it's going to be really important that all children understand what a thermometer is. And so I'm going to have to like really clearly define that vocabulary, and I want every child to know what that means. But if the word mercury comes into the text because it's talking about the liquid inside the thermometer, I'm going to have to define that, because they're going to need to know what that means, but I'm not going to spend loads of time on it because it's kind of distracting from the main learning. And so there's quite a lot of nuance then in like which words you're teaching, but also which words you're like explicitly teaching and spending time on and making sure they learn and coming back to.
Yeah, you care less if they forget like the definition of mercury in 6 months. You care less than if they forget what a thermometer is and does.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I you know, people can see on the screen there that PD session, and I sort of feel that I would have a pretty good sense of like running, if I had to run that PD session. You know, it's really neatly broken down to 5-10 minute chunks. There's loads of things for teachers to actually do to kind of like apply sort of what you're suggesting, as you said, of sort of like coding text with the different tier 3 and tier 2, and so great to include all of those PD sessions in every chapter. Let's move on to this next chapter that I'd like to talk about, which is disciplinary literacy. And I know that you this book, although it was published just a month ago, you've been writing this for a couple of years, and disciplinary literacy is so hot right now.
I know, great.
So great.
It wasn't as hot when I wrote this book.
Right. but it's in there. So this and I'm glad that disciplinary literacy is hot, because this idea that kids like writing in different subjects is different, and this you've got you start every chapter with these great summaries. There's a bullet point summary at the end, but you also have this kind of, you're a really busy subject lead. This, in a nutshell, at the start of the chapter, this is what is going to be included in here and emphasized. So it's great to kind of have that summary at the start of every chapter. Because I imagine some science leads are going to say, I'm pretty confident with my job, but I've got a new target about disciplinary literacy this year, and so I'm just going to dip into the chapter on disciplinary literacy because that's what I'm kind of focused on this year. But let's dig into some of this. So what are the absolutely kind of key points of disciplinary literacy that as you were getting to the chapter summary, you thought we really need to kind of like emphasize these, and how did you go about distilling that full chapter and all of its richness down to those kind of like key points?
Yeah, well, I think really, like echoing what you said, it is obviously really important. Literacy itself is important, and so making sure that we have literacy across the curriculum is massively important. But each discipline has its own way of essentially speaking, reading, and writing, and so we need to think about all three of those things when we're teaching pupils about science and we're potentially developing future scientists. Speaking, I actually talk about more in another subject, but it links, right? Because the way that you speak in science is often the way that you leads to the way that you write. You know, if we think about reading specifically, a scientific paper or a scientific text or journal looks really different to an adventure story or a history source. And so we do need to teach children the key features of those texts and how they understand and interpret and break down those texts. And again, we're coming back to vocabulary here, but what they do if they don't understand particular vocabulary within what they're reading. And then when we get to writing, which is a big meaty one, there's lots of interesting things about like science writing in particular. First of all, like we think about like, okay, but what are scientists actually going to be writing? And there's lots of writing that goes on in science that is a lovely way of children presenting what they've worked on. So I see a lot in different schools, like at the end of a unit, children will do like a lovely information text on, I don't know, the circulatory system, whatever they've been studying that term, which I think has value. And within that, we obviously need to think about how a scientist writes. So there are particular features of scientific writing, like, for example, scientists often write in the passive voice. So this is when the object of the action is placed at the beginning. So active would be the plant absorbed water through its roots. The passive is water was absorbed by the plants through its roots. So small things like that are what you would notice if you compared a piece of scientific versus non-scientific writing. And so just small changes that we can teach children when they're doing something like an information text, which they would maybe do across multiple subjects. So they'd maybe write an information text in history or geography as well. Like those small tweaks about how we make it actually sciencey, I think are really important. But on top of that, I also think we need to think about the type of things that children are writing in science. And I actually don't have my children writing information texts very often, because actually, if you think about the types of writing that most scientists are doing in the profession, and of course, there is, of course, science media, and there are science articles that are written that would be more information text based. But most scientists are writing research papers, and they're writing up investigations, and they're publishing papers in scientific journals. And so that for me is like a really important writing skill that my children need to leave primary school having. Obviously the primary appropriate version of it, but how do they write up methods, write up conclusions, present data? Like science writing is multimodal. Scientists present their ideas in writing, but they also use data and diagrams, etc. And so that needs to be part of our pupils' arsenal when they're writing about science.
I love it. I absolutely love
Sorry,
it.
my lights have gone off. If I wave at them a bit, they'll come back on.
Well, there we go. The light's back. Thank you for setting that out. That's really clear, sort of like what's really important, and does, I think, emphasize that there's quite a lot that's implicit there that we might imagine to be implicit with children, of if we were reading or maybe even writing like in a scientific text ourselves, I think a lot of us would probably use the passive voice, or if we were reading it, recognize that as kind of one of the approaches that science text takes, but we might not be able to articulate what's actually happening. And so by making the implicit explicit to children, that's going to mean that they're far more likely to be able to apply it. So thanks very much for sharing that, and that chapter there was really helpful. Let's move on to another case study, but it's from your excellent chapter on implementation, and you mentioned the EEF's guidance on implementation there, which is super. That the implementation guidance from the EEF is just such a fantastic guidance report. But what you've done is you've sciencified it. You have broken down every single phase and all of the conditions and everything that's sort of suggested, and you contextualized it into primary science and given very specific concrete examples of what those different phases and steps would look like for science, which I think is just so helpful, because this is almost certainly something that a science leader is going to be doing, writing an implementation plan or implementing a new initiative or approach. So could you just talk through a little bit about what you've learned as a science lead about good implementation, and how this chapter would kind of set science leads up for more effective implementation than you sometimes see in schools?
Yeah, well, a very honest answer that I'll start with, what I've learned about implementation from times when I maybe didn't do it so well, is that I am definitely, I'd say, a bit of an ideas person. And so I love getting excited about an idea, and I like the beginning stage of implementation. And then I would say I don't always, or at least I do it much better now, but I haven't always like had the correct follow through earlier in my career. And so having guidance like the EEF is really, really valuable, and like making sure that those like fantastic ideas that you have and those new initiatives, like they don't just die after a few months because you're not like consistently kind of assessing the progress, supporting teachers to implement fully. I think like early in my career, implementation for me probably was quite a short process, whereas now I like fully understand that it's a really ongoing long process. Sorry, Jon, there was another part of your question that I've now forgotten. Will you remind me?
Yeah, so well, I mean, it fits into that. So that's really helpful. But in this chapter, how would following this chapter through, like the different steps and the different phases of implementation, how is that going to help science leads to avoid what happened to you early in your career?
Yeah, well, I think it's exactly that. Is that, you know, plans that succeed are actually well thought through, and like so much time goes into the planning before it actually starts. And so this kind of just takes you through step by step, like what would you have to think about before you begin? What would you have to assess, you know? And then there's real examples and case studies for each of it. So even if they're not applicable to the actual problem that you're working through in your school, or the area that you've decided is the kind of most important thing to be working on, part of the development plan, etc., hopefully it like really brings it to life. Because you can see how someone else would have walked through it and what they would have done, you know, talking really explicitly about like learning walks or that meeting you're going to have with your line manager. I think just like adds a layer of detail that maybe isn't in the original guidance, but can maybe help bring some like actual life to it. So you can see how it would be used in different contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the specific examples on this one just are so sensible, and I think so they're not obvious though. So in this prepare phase, the fact that Rhonda is thinking about the process evaluation you put here, so how will I measure success, deciding that up front first of all, then that like what does success look like, more like better use of vocabulary for kids, but then how am I actually going to measure that? So planning in the sort of learning walks, but learning walks having a specific focus, which is vocab, because it's easy as a subject lead to have a bit of a wander, isn't it? A bit of a wander, a bit of a flick through the books. Whereas what you're advocating here is just so much more specific and intentional. I think that's what's so helpful about it.
Yeah, and I also think like time is precious for subject leaders. And so if you can be really intentional about it and also kind of have a really clear process, it can help you show your intention to your line manager. If having time out of class to do learning walks is something that you're potentially having to fight for, then, you know, having a really clear, like, okay, but this is part of this process and part of this plan makes that much easier.
Thanks, Kirsty. We're going to move on to a question that came through in the sign-up questions. And so this person asked, as a school, we've begun to use inquiry-based learning and using task design to develop children's deep understanding. Staff quite rightly are asking me for ideas for the task design activities, but this is where I'm having difficulty. So I know that within the book you draw on sort of the pretty strong evidence base now of the importance of explicit teaching, and so I just want to pick up on this idea of inquiry-based learning, because I think that it's sometimes used in two different ways. There's sort of framing knowledge and learning around inquiries, of having a very clear sort of inquiry for children to sort of be working towards solving. And if that's history, it could be, you know, how did the role of women change during the First World War? A clear inquiry, and then that doesn't mean that you're not doing any explicit teaching. In fact, it means that there's lots of explicit teaching to help children sort of answer that inquiry, but they know why they're learning something. It's not just a pub quiz, fact after fact. And then I suppose there's the other side to this, which I remember when I was, this is going to horrify you, I think, Kirsty, but when I was training to be a teacher, in my subject specific training, my subject sort of a part of my PGCE for science, they put like a load of crocodile clips and wires and bulbs out on the table. And they had nothing, they didn't say anything to us except for, you can begin. Yeah. And we like played with them and made some circuits and blah, blah, blah. And they said, you see, all you need to do is give children like the equipment and they'll be scientists. And we did like push back then and say, well, hold on a second, like, we're adults with degrees, like we kind of already knew how this stuff worked. But I think that side of inquiry-based learning was quite popular for a while, and I know that within the book, and this definitely chimes with my reading of the evidence, like suggests that some kids might benefit from that, but very likely lots are going to develop misconceptions or be a bit confused and likely to widen the gap. But putting that to one side at the moment, because we could talk about inquiry-based versus explicit instruction all evening. This idea of task design is a really good question, because task design is hard. Like you're going to do some explicit teaching, you're going to have like a load of content. At some point, you're going to ask the kids to do something. And so could you talk us through a little bit about like what you consider to be good task design, and how science leads can support teachers in making sure that the tasks that the kids are doing are really rich, but also meaningful and thought-provoking?
For sure. I think the key thing here is having an understanding of working memory and thinking about like intrinsic versus extraneous load whenever you're planning a task. So intrinsic load is like the inherent complexity of the material. So if you're learning about evolution, sorry, I always go back to evolution, but evolution like is going to be intrinsically a tricky concept to understand, versus the extraneous load, which is like mental effort caused by poor task design. So for example, I mean, this is a classic, this is like an observation I had as a teacher trainee, but it just is such a good example of it, is we were doing a history lesson, it was some sort of timeline based lesson. The main LO was that the children needed to understand, you know, what came before and what came after. And my task was so poorly designed. I'm sure you can guess what I'm about to say. They all had to cut out lots of things and stick them onto a timeline. And it was an early year 3 class with really poor fine motor skills. And so the whole like lesson was derailed by that huge extraneous load of the children having to cut and stick things, that actually, like, was I confident by the end of the lesson that they genuinely understood what came before and what came after? Whereas if there had been zero cutting and sticking, and you know, I designed the task in a different way, or even just like had loads of like quizzing in the input, what comes first, what comes after, what comes first, what comes after, like that would have been way more successful. And I think like that is really important, and it's important in any subject. I just used a history example. It is of course important in science. I think in science you also have to really think about like, what is the main learning in terms of knowledge versus skills do you want your children to leave that lesson having mastered? Because in our science lessons, there are always going to be a blend of like, there's always going to be a blend of knowledge, a blend of knowledge and practical skills. We're always going to be teaching them some new science, and often they will be using practical skills in order to conduct experiments to kind of further their understanding of those new concepts. And so for us then as teachers or as science leaders planning curriculum, when we're planning the task that they're going to do at the end of the lesson, we need to really think like, okay, but is the task because I want them to consolidate that knowledge that we learned this lesson? Is that task because I want to like push them deeper on that knowledge? Or is the task going to involve some sort of practical skills, in which case is the focus still the knowledge, but I need them to use some practical skills? Or actually, is the focus about these practical skills this lesson, and so I need to explicitly teach that? Okay, if we're planning curriculum, then I need to explicitly teach those practical skills before I get to the lesson where they're going to be using them in addition to the knowledge. Like, and so I think that's what you need to think about when you're planning a task. It's like, what is the main thing I want them to focus on? I don't want them to get distracted by reading measuring cylinders if that's not the main thing of the lesson, and I think they're going to find that tricky. Does that make sense, Jon?
It makes total sense. Really helpful. So inquiries are good as a kind of motivator and a framing, but they don't mean that explicit teaching can kind of isn't necessary. They're still going to require some explicit teaching. And then when it comes to then the task design, you're saying we need to really clearly respect pupils' working memory limitations, and so ensure that the task is not asking them, it's not going to overload them, and is not going to ask them to think about something which is not the core learning. But also there should be an intentionality over the task should get them to think about the thing that you want them to remember, whether that's a key piece of knowledge or a key skill or a key sort of like practical thing. That's really helpful.
Does that help? And I'd say in lots of my science lessons, the task is not very complicated. It's often answering a series of questions on the knowledge that I've just taught them to see whether they understand it, with maybe some like depth and misconception drilling added in there. Or we're doing a practical because we are testing that knowledge we've just learned to see if our experiment will give us we've just learned that plants need light. Okay, let's set up an experiment to test that hypothesis. And then the task is conducting that experiment and potentially writing that experiment up. So actually,
the joy of science, I suppose, is that the variety. There's an inherent variety of tasks. I think sometimes with history or geography, you're kind of like manufacturing. I don't want them just writing another sentence in response to this. Like, how can I get them to do something that's a bit different? Whereas in science, that's kind of inherent within it. The variety of, sometimes you do need to label stuff. Sometimes you do need to kind of like write a paragraph. Sometimes you do need to conduct a small experiment. Sometimes you do need to watch like a short video of something and jot down sort of like observations about it, but it's helpful for you to kind of, as you say, sort of emphasize that the design of that task should be focused on what you want the kids to actually remember and take with them in the long term. I'm going to move on. We have just 1 minute left to go. And Shranti, I think that you want to talk a little bit about the where folks can get their copies of the book if they haven't already got their hands on them. So I'll hand over to you to talk about that, if that's okay.
Yeah, really briefly. We've got the How to Lead at Primary Science ISBN in the chat, a link to the website where you can go and purchase this book or any of the other books in the series, all of which, of course, are edited by Jon. And there's some information in there about bulk discounts as well, in case you're working with an institution and you'd like to buy more than 20 copies. You can always get in touch with our team to make that a little bit easier with the school's discount as well.
Thanks, Shanti, and please do let your friends, colleagues, networks know about this. For those of us who have been subject leads, we know that can feel pretty lonely, and you can often feel a bit out of your depth, but you don't want to really talk about that because you've got this responsibility. And so this series really came out of Kirsty, me, all of us sort of feeling that at some point and thinking that everybody deserves, if they're doing those roles, they deserve to have something in one place where there is that guidance and support and development. So we'd love for more people to know about them. So please do share with your networks, folks. With that, we're at time. That's absolutely flown by, and we could go for another hour, Kirsty, but we mustn't. Maybe another time. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that gave you a flavour of some of the stuff that's in the book. Just picked out 5 pages, but you'll see from the copy of the book, there's another 175 odd ones in there, just as good and rich. It's absolutely packed with fantastic stuff that will support you. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope that you enjoy the book, find it useful, and able to share it with others that you work with. Angela, yes, there is going to be a recording shared. It will be emailed out to you following this, but it will also be on the Bloomsbury YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that.
Thank you, everyone.